Good morning, everybody. Nice to be with you. David in the back with the beard in the middle there thinks I'm really weird. I was like trying to get his name because he was the first one in the room. He came in like really early. Yeah. And I'm going, it's 7:30 in the morning, and we're talking about biosimilars in Chicago. It must be a good day. I mean, so you must know so much more. Well, not just much more than I do, but you must know that we've got people that really represent the vast dimensions of the cancer area, and we're going to be with each other for the next 2 hours because I get to moderate every session, and it's much more fun if I have you guys working with me in that. So we'll grill these guys, and I want to go to all of you, and let's just turn this into a fun marathon together, okay? And we'll give you all a medal at the end or something. But thank you very much for being here. So let me just start out and ask you, Gary, kind of help us frame this discussion on biosimilars. We have a panelist coming up later in the third session who said the only reason to talk about biosimilars is cost. If they're not cheaper, if they don't dramatically impact the cost factor, then this is a stupid discussion and a sort of, I'm adding that to her comment. She didn't ask the stupid piece, but help us frame why this is a significant avenue of possibility in the healthcare field.
Well, cost is certainly part of the issue.
But so you're critiquing her, it's not only, because she said only.
Yes, it is not the only issue. There are many other issues, but a lot of them are related to cost. Access to these exciting class of new agents, biologic therapies, which while they've come with a lot of hype, there are several that have made dramatic changes in the management, treatment, and outcomes of patients with cancer. But if you can't get them because of cost, because of the rapidly rising cost of these agents, even at the time of approval, which continues to go up post-approval in the marketplace, in practice, they don't do you any good if you can't get to them. So one of the goals here is to improve access, and to do that, part of the equation is lowering the cost, lowering the price, and then, of course, getting into the issue of value-based pricing. I'm sure they'll discuss that with you.
Right.
Matching what the drugs do in terms of clinical impact to the price of the drug.
So we've had about 10 biosimilars, as I understand it, somewhere around 10. I interviewed Scott Gottlieb, the head of the FDA, the other day, and he wasn't quite sure, but he says 9, 10, 11, somewhere in there. And in the United States, and I guess they're nearly 30.
Depends on the day you're talking about.
Right, nearly 30 in Europe. So in terms of you sort of seeing a different framing and different incentives and different behaviors in the health ecosystem, as you just described it, given what we've seen already, have you seen any vast improvement? Has there been any change in that ecosystem?
We're far too early to draw any conclusions.
So you're a faith-based guy.
We have to be. Now that faith is premised on, of course, the European experience, which is anywhere from 5 to 10 years ahead of us, and they have not seen major safety concerns that led to withdrawal of the biosimilars, and there has been an impact in a much more complicated multi-country setting on costs. It's not as dramatic as generics. For simple molecules, generics have brought down the price of many of the older medications, but the biologics are very complicated. They're complex, produced in living cells. So there's a base cost to developing these and marketing that we're not going to be able to go below. But the hope is, and the anticipation, and like you say, my faith is that over time, this will either bring down the cost or at least bend the cost curve so that this rapid rise that we've seen will be blunted to some degree in the coming years, and access, availability of these agents for patients in the appropriate setting will be improved.
Chadi, you're a CMO, and go ahead, yeah.
Comments regarding the access.
But just do it loudly.
Is my microphone on?
Yeah, you go, yeah.
Nobody's ever asked me to speak.
Oh, yeah.
They usually ask me to speak less volume.
Higher.
But
it's 8 in the morning.
In terms of access, I think access would probably play a major role in low and middle income countries. Probably, again, because the cost of development of these biosimilars will be less than biologics in general.
Right.
So, again, there are many patients in low and middle income countries who may not have access to these biologics. It could be life savings. So having these biosimilars may allow them to get better access. So it doesn't necessarily just apply here, but I do think that there is a significant unmet need in the low middle income countries.
So is there an implication by what you just shared that when you're looking at you're looking at the international side
Right. I mean,
of
there's-
deployment and application and cost and saying, here's a leg up. But I mean, I just want to tease this out. Are you then implying that while you're giving solutions to low-income nations, developing nations, that there are sort of health outcome differences between the place you have biologics versus the place you have biosimilars?
No.
In other words, the high spending place goes with one avenue, and the developing world goes with another.
Oh, and we don't know that. We don't. I mean, I don't believe that the high spending necessarily has correlated historically with better outcomes of patients. I mean, I think we have many data to the contrary of that. Mm-hmm. But I just think, from terms of access, having more options in general will allow better access for patients to receive additional drugs. That access might be significantly important for the low and middle income countries because their access is already severely affected.
You know, I had the privilege of interviewing Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont, and his wife suffered with cancer, and the costs even for him, who's a pretty well-connected guy, were staggeringly high, and that's in country in the U.S. So how much of this? I mean, I was surprised. I didn't know we were going to talk about the international dimension so quickly. But how much of this becomes a game changer within the U.S. system?
Well, let's be honest. The cost of healthcare in the U.S. is just way out of proportion to the rest of the world, including our developing peer countries in Western Europe and Asia. And yet our healthcare outcomes by multiple metrics are no better, and in some cases worse than many of our, what we would consider the developed world with sophisticated healthcare systems. So we have this disconnect between what we're paying for our healthcare and what we're getting for our healthcare, what we call value. And I think one of the goals of biosimilars is to bring that into better alignment, bring the cost for these new therapies down, because without some constraints on it, and this is just part of the puzzle, it's not going to be the total final solution to the cost issue here, but to bring the value in line so, again, patients can get access, they can afford, they don't go bankrupt when they get a diagnosis of cancer. They don't have to stop treatment or leave their family with an enormous debt if they don't get through the cancer.
But ultimately, and I think Gary and I agree on this, I mean, the cost savings have somehow to translate to patients, out-of-pocket costs and so forth.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that's, in order for patients not to go bankrupt and not to actually be affected if they have access to these lower-priced drugs, then some of these cost savings have to be given to patients, which I'm not really sure this is where we're going to be.
It's not going to come automatically with biosimilars.
Right.
It's going to require, again, legislation, congressional action, the industry, the payer community, CMS, all coming into alignment to find solutions, because it is the patient who is ultimately left with the debt.
Let me challenge you both in a friendly way. When I sit in and have participated in many of these healthcare forums, you see very earnest people, very earnest members of Congress, very earnest members of industry, patient advocacy organizations, and others that are coming in and trying to improve the system, which is complex, costly. There are lots of inefficiencies built in. But one of the frustrations I see building, and I don't know if it's part of the biosimilar debate, but I just sort of see it in things like the right to try legislation, which just passed, which a lot of people are applauding and saying, yay, that's great. Or looking at FDA approval process. We did a program the other day, the Atlantic did, on pediatric cancer, and trying to give companies incentives to move FDA processes faster with essentially coupons if they in fact develop cancer drugs for children. And what I sort of feel is people are frustrated with the approval system and want shortcuts, want faster movement. And I just wonder, at some point, where does health deteriorate? Where do important standards deteriorate? And I'm just wondering if that's part of the biosimilar discussion as well.
Well,
Chadi?
I mean, I'll take a first stab at this. I mean, I think...
You think it's a fair question?
I think it's a fair question. It's complicated.
I know you're an enthusiast, so...
It's a very... Enthusiast of what? Well, it's... It's a very complicated question, but and the answer is actually complicated. Number one is you have to have a balance between trying to get drugs to market and maintain innovation, but at the same time, the regulations are there to assure safety and to be safeguards of making sure that patients who are receiving these drugs are not going to be harmed by unidentified adverse events, by certain complications that may have been missed because you just rushed certain medications immediately to market. And hence, there's a lot of emphasis on pharmacovigilance, on post-marketing approval, making sure that there are lots of observational studies to assure we understand how these drugs are used in market and identify certain sequelae that we need to intervene. So I don't believe that omitting regulations completely is going to help patients. I think it could be very risky and could be a slippery slope. It's really trying to find that balance and try to make sure that we would like to get these drugs to market to be innovative, but at the same time want to make sure patient safety are assured. Now, from a biosimilar perspective, biosimilars, yes, there's a different regulatory pathway to get biosimilars through the FDA process, but it's not 2 or 3 years. I mean, it still could take up to 10 years plus to get a biosimilar to market. So it is, you do have to do a lot of the PK, PD studies, preclinical studies to assure the similarity and so forth. And then you do need to do at least one comparative trial that is large enough to make sure that there is no differences in efficacy and safety. So from a biosimilar perspective, since this is really the topic that we're discussing, it is not as short as people might assume, but it's certainly different pathway and maybe shorter than an actual biologic because you're not doing a larger phase 3 randomized controlled trial to demonstrate superiority. Just a different, we call it reverse paradigm.
So you're okay with the system as it is now?
For the biosimilars, yes.
Right, yes. And I think Scott Gottlieb, the head of the FDA, is fine with it as well, but I have read that there are others in the industry that are not satisfied.
There's no question.
And that there are divisions in industry.
Yeah,
There are
and
some
not
want
just
very high standards and want current standards, which they largely approve of, and others that basically say they're essentially built-in speed blocks and
right.
roadblocks.
I rarely defend the FDA because I challenge them on many
give it to
many
us,
issues.
full-throated defense.
And I presume Dr. Gottlieb isn't behind us here.
Yeah,
But
we're on video. He's watching right now.
But they're in a almost untenable situation because of the demand for early access to therapies. This includes the biosimilars, but not limited to that. They've put in place a number of expedited approval mechanisms, not to shortcut the issues, but to streamline and be sure that safety is preserved while the drug access is made available to patients, particularly with severe life-threatening diseases. And in that setting, and this includes the biosimilars, we want to make sure that just pure bureaucratic barriers are moved away, and that the focus is entirely on safety and efficacy of these drugs. So the push, as Chadi was alluding to, for biosimilars is not on multiple large phase 3 randomized trials that cost literally hundreds of millions of dollars to do, but it's on the preclinical work to make sure that the biosimilar is highly similar to the original reference product, which has been fully tested, gone through the traditional mechanism approval, and that it functions the same, it behaves the same, and then you have some clinical data that it's efficacious and safe. And that will, it still takes years to do, but it cuts many years off the full developmental sequence and reduces the cost. This is why they can be brought to market. I believe at considerably shorter and with a lower cost. I do raise the concern, and this would have to take CMS action, that these should probably come on the market at a lower price than the reference biologic. So far, it looks like it can, but it's purely voluntary. There probably needs to be a cap on what the biosimilars pricing can be compared to the innovator. Otherwise, we're not making progress.
The filgrastim example so far has
Right.
come to market at lower price
Yes, right.
than the
So
original.
what are the, so give me a scale. Is it 90% of the price or is it 20% of the price?
I don't
Like
think-
how much of an impact what are the models
The models
project?
are suggesting maybe 80% or
So
70 to 80%.
so 80% of
Well,
the price is worth
I mean,
all of this
no,
fuss?
you think 80% lower than the biologic?
No, 20% lower.
Okay.
80% of the
You
cost.
scared me a little bit.
Yes.
That's
Oh, wait, so
No.
20%.
I mean, I think
Generics come in about
generics.
80%
Yeah, I mean,
lower.
the reason generics obviously, have reduced cost of care significantly is because they came to market at 90% lower than
Discount,
the actual.
yeah.
Right. You're not going to see this with biosimilars.
No.
I think we can both agree that nobody knows how much lower the biosimilar will be than biologics. We've done actually some market research, primary market research, asking oncologists, trying to understand at what price point maybe they feel that this is really a good value to patients as well as to practitioners. And to Gary's point,
So you're raising a very important point. You're
the
saying
sweet
the
spot is
cost
about
savings,
20%.
but you're saying the cost savings are in doubt.
Well, when you talk about cost savings,
I'm just trying to drill down.
right.
Yeah.
When you talk about cost savings, there's cost savings to the healthcare system, and there's cost savings to patients. So I don't think we have enough information in the U.S. market today to know whether the biosimilar, well, we only have really one biosimilar in oncology, has really led to significant cost savings. We know it was cheaper than the biologic. We know the market uptake to an extent. There is a good market research study, actually good analysis by Rand Corporation that published a couple of years ago that suggested if you actually use biosimilars, although it used a lot of European studies to actually
Right.
get that data, but the take-home message was that you could actually save between $44 to $54 billion in the U.S. if biosimilars are widely adopted in the U.S.
Over the next decade.
Over
Right.
the next decade,
Yeah.
up to 2026.
So let me ask you, I mean, we're going to have other panels that discuss the regulatory process, the value prospect, and, again, in terms of just sort of framing what these big issues are, I was talking to Richard Marcus, who will be on stage of Amgen later, and just, he's a smart guy, but we're talking about Europe and how many biosimilars had been approved there, and he says, well, sometimes they have the same biosimilar named two different things, so they get two on the till as opposed to just one, and that there are questions of how you count. And so for a new industry, there seems to be a remarkable amount of fuzziness. And I just want to ask you guys about literacy, both literacy of people in the profession, probably have the most literate room in the world here on this subject, meeting at this time, but in terms of the kind of broad health business, the pharmaceutical industry, and then the practitioner industry, what are the challenges in literacy and kind of bringing them up to speed in terms of the realities of biosimilars, the prospect?
I think it's a real challenge. We recently came out with a statement from ASCO, American Society of Clinical Oncology. Of course, we're
They happen
here
to
at
be
the
meeting in
annual
town
meeting. Yes,
coincidentally,
I've
right?
heard that. Yeah, I guess so. And the whole goal here was education, was improving the literacy, not only of providers,
So who needs to
oncologists.
become more literate first?
Everybody.
Everybody, yeah.
Everybody,
The,
I mean-
the oncologists, the other, a lot of cancer care is delivered in the community by primary care. Patients, the insurers, they have to better understand these issues. And last but not least, the policymakers need to better understand what we're talking about when you're talking about things like interchangeability, switching, all these terms, extrapolation, that are somewhat, they're not new, but they're coming to the forefront of biosimilars.
And not too long ago, I mean, folks were really confusing biosimilars with generics. I mean,
Right.
there's really a sense, excuse me, biosimilars are generics, and they're not. But
It's all the molecules.
I also
yeah.
think patient education is extremely important, and trying to explain this to patients so they can understand what biosimilars are is critical. One of the issues that we'll have to deal with is if the switching and the interchangeability ever happen here, how much patients will be involved in this? Do you actually sit down and say, I'm going to switch now from the innovator to the biosimilar, and why? And what's the patient's reaction to such switching? I mean, we all know that we've all had patients who were very opposed to getting anything generic. So I want the real medicine. I don't want the generic. And would this really happen in the biosimilar market? Too early. I think the conversations need to start now. We need to have the discussions. But from an education perspective,
what kind of
everybody
liability do doctors face if they, because I mean, I find this such a fascinating discussion, because if you read the FDA regs, which I did last night, it was brutal. But the interchangeability.
You went to sleep right away.
Yeah, the interchangeability is, well, I kind of got frustrated because I was looking at this thing. Steve, my team said, you've got to ask about interchangeability. So I get in and ask about interchangeability, and the FDA clearly says there is no interchangeability. Now, when talking to Dr. Marcus a minute ago, he really refined this in terms of the prescription process of not wanting to do this. And I assume there's some liability issue. So let me just, I want to go to the audience here just a minute. What are the best things that you see, both of you are in this, the needles that can be moved to solve some of those challenges and make it easier in terms of, I guess, practiced interchangeability, whether it's legal interchangeability? And I see a semantic tension there, but tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, no biosimilar in the U.S. have interchangeability designation right now. But in order for interchangeability to take place, you need to do switching studies. And these switching studies basically allows you to change between the innovator and the biosimilar at any phase of care without having any issues. There's a lot of work on the state level to make sure that this actually, they're able to do
because that's where the law is,
Right, to be able to do this, interchangeability, but providers they still have to sign off on it.
Has anyone done it yet? At the state level, no.
Well,
at the state level, there are laws have been put in place, and several other states are considering them, that would require notification. So if you write for a biosimilar or the reference product, and a pharmacy fills it with something else, which will come if there is interchangeability, that at least that clinician will be notified.
And he can overrule that.
And he can overrule that.
He could say, he gets notified, and he could say, no, go back to the biologics. So it's very different process. I mean, so yes, you could try to do it on the state level and you notify, but we're far away from.
So, again, if you're going to change one thing in this system of approval of biosimilars, what would it be? Just real short.
So, to me, the overriding concern is what's going to happen with the pricing. I don't want industry to take the model of the airplane industry or the travel industry and just price where the market can bear. They need to price so that we can rein in the cost, bring the cost down, and improve access to these agents.
Thank you. Let me go to the audience now. We've got my friend in the back.
Hi, I'm Mundia. I'm the medical director of South Nassau Oncology. We're a private practice, oncology practice. And, I think the promise of biosimilars is accessibility. And so shouldn't the FDA, along with efficacy and safety, require a promise of accessibility from people who are developing biosimilars? I mean, just because it's going to be cheaper doesn't mean it's going to be more accessible.
Right. So accessibility, which is where you started out at the beginning, right? So, but I mean, I guess the question is, shouldn't the FDA shift what it sees or its
This would require
priorities?
a change in the FDA mandate, though,
Right.
and that comes from Congress. If any of you have been on the Oncology Drug Advisory Committee advising the FDA on approval or disapproval of agents, you read the Riot Act right at the very beginning. Don't talk about cost. The only purpose of that discussion will be to be sure that this is a safe and effective drug. I agree with you completely. That should be part of the mandate brought to the FDA, accessibility and making sure that these agents improve access to appropriate and optimal therapy. But right now, they don't have the authority, to my understanding, to actually
Chadi?
do that.
Yeah, I mean, I would step back and just try to understand what we mean by accessibility. Is it the fact that you get the approval, for example, you have the two biosimilars that were approved for bevacizumab and trastuzumab, but they're not yet available, right? I mean, until 2019 and just who knows how long. If that's what you mean by accessibility, Yes, I mean, I think there should be, and that goes back to, again, patent litigations and other things that usually take place. So if you have to do something specific to improve the availability of biosimilars, I would say the two things I would say that will make a huge impact is interchangeability and looking at patent litigations between manufacturers of biosimilars and biologics to try to resolve this issue to make sure they're more accessible.
Other question, comment. You got to grill him too. I'm going to go to you. He's real smart. Guy in the front, right? Yeah, you got a question. I met him in the audience a little while ago, and he said, I said, what do you do? I said, I do cancer,
Oh,
you know.
thanks. Well, I think it's an interesting discussion.
So let me ask you a question. Why are you here this morning? I mean, in terms of the biosimilar industry, and you were very great when I was speaking to you. So what in the biosimilars world do you sort of look at in terms of its prospects for what you're doing?
Personally, I work with breast cancer patients quite a bit. So I'm working radiology and breast imaging, and we work with oncologists highly extensively.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of promise there in the breast cancer market as well, and we're excited to see what comes out of it. I know we don't have very many at this point in terms of drugs in the U.S., biosimilar drugs, but I'm excited to see what, like you said, the promise for the future holds, because we've made advances in breast cancer care, and we hope to make many more.
Yeah, and as we go on in this morning, I think one of the interesting things would be to hear from those who have experience and knowledge about what's happened in Europe in terms of the efficacy and outcomes, which I know you
Just
said
the
is
payer market in Europe
Yeah.
is very different than here.
It's
I mean, I
what?
think the payer market in Europe is just very different than here. And I think that's one thing that I think what
But
we
different
can,
than the
but what
payer
we-
market, the question is, what are the outcomes?
Right,
What are the
what-
health outcomes, and are they
So
different?
What we can learn from Europe, at least what I take from the European market, is these drugs are safe. When patients take them instead of the innovator, they are going to do just as good. They're effective. There are no major issues. And there's a lot, again, there's over a decade of experience with this, and that should provide reassurance for the US patients and providers as they use these biosimilars. I just think from a payer and cost issue, it's just very different. So I'm not sure whether that's scalable to here, how they do it in Europe.
Gary, any quick thoughts?
Excuse me.
Any quick reactions as well to this?
Well,
to the-
no, I think we will soon have trastuzumab available. It's been approved, as Chadi indicated, but not on the marketplace. One of the things is we have to make sure that once approval is granted by the FDA's and the primary patents expired, these agents can get out there. They can't languish in the courts for years and years, and I think that's all part of the equation. The European experience has been very different. They haven't faced that level of challenge to the movement of these products into the marketplace. So they get out there, as was said, they've proven to be safe and effective. We have every reason to think there'll be that here, but we need to be vigilant. We need to continue to monitor these agents post-marketing with surveillance, reporting adverse events, any unexpected, rare, delayed side effects. All this has to be captured over time to reassure the doctors and to reassure the patients that this is truly a safe and effective approach.
Well, thank you both for helping us to frame our opening discussion. Gary Lyman and Chadi Nabhan, thank you so much.